live, but we are make use of that opportunity as well. And there it is.
Adam with
Thank
the
you,
technology.
Adam. Adam has posted the that's the sources. Um, let me introduce our speaker this morning, Rabbi Leanne Morris, who's the president of Pardes and is also an alumni of its year program and its summer program. He and his family made Aliyah back in 2014. Before that, he served as the rabbi of Temple Addis, Israel in Sag Harbor, New York, and was also the founding director of the Skirball Center for Adult Jewish Learning at Temple Emmanuel, now Temple Emmanuel Stryker Center in Manhattan. Before coming to Pardes, Leanne served as a vice president for Israel programs at the Shalom Hartman Institute and was a faculty member at HUC, Hebrew Union College. He was ordained from HUC in 1997, where he was a Wexner Graduate Fellow, and has taught at Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform institutions, and is a regular contributor to the Jewish, US, and Israeli press. He's an editor of the Reform movement's Mishkan HaNefesh, our high holiday Machzor, and is a contributor to Jewish Theology in Our Time. A New Generation explores the foundations and future of Jewish belief. Jewish Lights publication, if you want to find it. Is there anything, if there's anything I've left off, I'm sure there is much. Please feel free to share that with us as well. And we look forward to learning with you this morning. And thank you so much for being here and joining us this morning.
Thank you so much, Sydney. I want to just say that I'm really honored to be with you this morning and humbled to be teaching a group of colleagues. I hope this will be more of a chavruta together of some ideas that I want to explore with you through text than a shiur. I also just want to say, and I'm sure you know this, that you are enormously blessed by my friend and colleague Rini Dickman's leadership. When I heard about her new appointment, I just felt like this is an amazing asset to the Chicago rabbinate. Her modesty, her gentle strength, her compassion, and her warmth. I'm sure you've been experiencing that over even during this unusual last year, but you're very blessed to have her at the helm of this. And I'm so touched that my rabbi and teacher, Barry Friedman, is joining today. Barry was my childhood rabbi in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. I'm the Jew that I am today in large measure because of his leadership. The way in which he took the budding interest of an 8 or 9 year old boy and took the time to really nurture it, and continues to be my rabbi and teacher. I know there's a halacha about you're not allowed to teach in front of your teacher, so I guess this is where I say, well, I'm a liberal rabbi, but I'm really grateful that you're here, Barry. So I want to start with the personal, which my wife Dasi is always encouraging me to do. It doesn't always come naturally. I think in some ways, the text that I'm exploring, we could call this, why am I a tzitzit wearing, Shomer Shabbat, tefillin laying Reform rabbi? Why am I liberal yet always drawn to mitzvot and to ritual mitzvot? And to some extent, the text that I want to study with you reflects the way in which personal choice or informed choice didn't quite capture for me what I experienced within the mitzvah system. And I feel like for many years, I've been looking for a way to kind of undo the dichotomy between heteronomy and autonomy. What's that middle ground, or how can we have both? And I've been searching for many years about ways of thinking about duty and obligation and commandedness that still allow me to accept everything I know about the development of Jewish law and human authorship of the Torah and the way in which Judaism, like everything else, is a product of history. And part of what I kind of landed on many years ago, was introduced to 10 or 11 years ago, was this philosophical notion of second naivete. One definition of second naivete is faith reconstituted in the aftermath of criticism. Faith reconstituted in the aftermath of criticism. This was a concept that was developed initially by a German Catholic theologian named Peter Wust, but it was developed most fully in the 20th century by Paul Ricoeur, and it was kind of made Jewish by the philosophy of education professor Ernest Akiva Simon. So the idea here, this is familiar to some of you, is that there are stages. It could play out in an individual's life. There's a primary naivete. There's a set of understandings about what's true and how the world works. And usually when we reach adolescence, we begin to experience a stage that Paul Ricoeur called demythologization. We realize that these myths that we were raised on aren't true. And most people kind of stop there. And what Ricoeur developed and Ernest Simon developed was this notion that there is a third stage, which is a second naivete. It's not like the first. It's not like the primary naivete. It's a naivete that is kind of freely entered into, that helps us go beyond the criticism, beyond the critique, that enables us to hear the original myth in a new way. And one of the things that Ernest Simon did was he said, well, this applies not only to the life of an individual, these three stages: primary naivete, demythologization, and then sometimes a second naivete. Ernest Simon said this also applies to the life of the Jewish people, that we can think about, before modernity, all of the classic Jewish notions, which were axiomatic, right? That Bnei Yisrael crossed the Yam Suf on dry land, and the Torah, both written and oral, was given to Moses at Mount Sinai, and we could go through the whole list. And then those challenges of those principles of Jewish faith were challenged by the Enlightenment, and let's say, maybe starting with Spinoza and then continuing through a scientific study of Judaism. And all the foundations of Judaism seem to be challenged. And we as a people were in that second stage of demythologization. The discovery of ancient Near Eastern myths, realizing that there's a similarity between our sacred texts and those of the nations that surrounded us. We got stuck in this period of demythologization. And my sense is that a lot of Judaism remains stuck to this day in that stage of demythologization. So second naivete comes to say, again, faith reconstituted in the aftermath of criticism. Once a myth becomes shattered, there is still a way for it to be restored. We don't retreat to believing in the original myth. That's the fundamentalist term. Let's go back to the first naivete, the primary naivete. Most of us aren't able to do that, but second naivete brings us to a new way of understanding the myth. We may never again have the immediacy of belief that we experienced as children during the stage of primary naivete, or the sort, if we take it to the level of the history of our people, we may never again restore a sort of faithfulness that we experienced earlier in our people's history. But, says Second Naivete, we can still reclaim these myths in new ways. Another way of speaking about this, I think, is to say that while we no longer think of the myth as factually true, we understand the myth in profound ways that shape and touch our lives. So this is kind of the idea that I want to explore further with you in this chavruta together through some of the text on the sheet. And maybe Rini, we can, if we can share the source sheet. And I think you'll be able to adjust how much of the source sheet you want to see and how much of each other you want to see by adjusting that bar that's probably very familiar from a year of Zoom to all of us. So I want to start with, because I gave the somewhat lengthy introduction of the idea with source number 3. We'll come back to 1 and 2 of Paul Ricoeur writing about this. The dissolution of the myth as explanation is the necessary way to the restoration of the myth as symbol. Thus, the time of restoration is not a different time from that of criticism. We are in every way children of criticism. We seek to go beyond criticism by means of criticism, but a criticism that is no longer reductive but restorative. There's a lot in this, and I have the advantage of having read this a lot of times. I think he's emphasizing here that we don't put aside, we don't ignore all of the criticism that was part of demythologizing the myth. That criticism is also our inheritance, but we can go beyond criticism. We can critique the critique. We can say, well, that's very reductionist, just to say whatever it is that these texts emerged through, that these texts are authored by human beings, or that this ritual is a product of history. It's reductionist to say that's all it is. And why can't we use the tool of criticism to critique the critique? To be here, he says, not just to be reductive, but to be restorative. How can we use all these tools at our disposal to restore them? I like to use the phrase that if part of modernity is about a hermeneutic of suspicion, can we move beyond the hermeneutic of suspicion to a hermeneutic of embrace? Not ignoring all of the critique that's part of the hermeneutic of suspicion. I want to jump to that third paragraph here. Does that mean we could go back to a primary naivete? Not at all. In every way, something has been lost, irremediably lost, immediacy of belief. But if we can no longer live the great symbolisms of the sacred in accordance with the original belief in them, we modern men, I was writing in the 1940s, I think, we can aim at a second naivete in and through criticism. In short, it is by interpreting that we can hear again. So I love this. It feels, even though it was written by a French Catholic theologian, it feels very Jewish, right? By interpreting, we can hear again. That's our set of hermeneutics. And I think a lot of contemporary Jews intuit this. And here we'll just go back for a moment to source 1. I think the turn in the liberal synagogue toward a Misha Berach for the sick was not only because Debbie Friedman, Aleha L'Shalom, composed an amazing setting and text for that. I think there's something really noteworthy about a shift that allows critical, skeptical, largely untraditional Jews to pray for their friends and family who are in need of healing. And I think it's one example. Rini, if you don't mind just going up to source one, it's one example of the kind of very intuitive sense of second naivete without using such a highfalutin term. I think the other place that we see it on the ground in our synagogues and in our communities is saying Kaddish for a parent or a spouse or a child or a sibling. This sense that, I mean, I know from my own experience of saying Kaddish for my parents, I know the origin, I know how late the origin is, as you do, of saying Kaddish for a parent, and how it's based on a story about a man who had a despicable man who had a son, and the father, by virtue of the son leading the tefillot, which included Kaddish, made his neshama made its way into the world to come. I know all of that, and yet it was a very powerful experience for me, as it has been for so many, to feel as if my parents' soul depended on me each and every day to say Kaddish. So maybe there's a little bit of right brain, left brain here. There's an element of acting as if, I see in the chat, Sydney said, right, willful suspension of disbelief. I think there's an element of that. I think that doesn't capture it entirely, because I'm carrying that disbelief with me. I'm not totally suspending it, but I'm realizing that that's one facet, and that I can critique that disbelief. Michael, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just wonder if the second naivete you're describing is truer for a certain type of people and not in general. In other words, the example you're giving about Kaddish, I think, is different between how you understand yourself, what you're doing, or a mishaber for that, or versus how people in the pews are understanding what they're doing. Many do not know the history of Kaddish, and if anything, the attraction of it is that they're doing something that's always been done. So I'm just wondering if the people in the pews are where you are at with this. I mean, I agree with this. You know, the ideas you're setting out, I think, are great, and it's very important. I just don't know if it's trickled down. Even if they're belonging to liberal congregations, but their level of belief is still really pretty traditional, even if they may not believe in Torah Messina and all that stuff. But their core level of belief in God is not second naivete, but first naivete.
I really appreciate that. I want to just kind of hold that and stay with that, and maybe, you know, as we look at some other frames, we'll ask ourselves, like, is this, you know, I like very much your question. Is this for us? But for Amcha, there maybe that tension is a little less pronounced, and maybe the ability to kind of live with a certain theological inconsistency or confusion is easier. Yes, Steve, please.
Yeah, it sounds to me, and I appreciate what Michael was saying, and I've had the same experience, I guess, personally and with my Christian colleagues, my liberal Christian colleagues, who have a certain kind of faith that they're almost afraid to talk about. in front of their congregations. And perhaps what you're emphasizing is an obligation we have to help them demythologize and post-mythologize if we're going to teach with that kind of integrity.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I like that very much. I want to look with you at at least two examples, sources 4 and 5, of, I think, people that were writing in this mode of second naivete, even though they didn't call it that. And then I want to show you a third example that is a contemporary Israeli musical artist who I think is also playing with these ideas. So Richard Rubinstein, this is from his 1966 book, After Auschwitz. And for some reason, maybe one of you knows, in the subsequent editions of After Auschwitz, this chapter isn't there. And this is his critique of the critique of liberal Judaism omitting tefillot that have to do with korbanot. This is his critique of the modern sensibility that the language of sacrifice is primitive. And so that's all I'll say to set it up. Let's just read it together. Many of the most creative aspects of religious literature dwell on the mysteries and profundities of sacrifice. The mystics did not need more than liturgical formulations and the vivid presentations of the old order, which they found in rabbinic literature, to create a vast and significant body of literature. Our own time bespeaks its religious and emotional impoverishment in its failure to find a place for the totality of the human psyche within its religious life. At the very least, those who are concerned with a meaningful religious life ought not to remain insensitive to the enormously fruitful potentialities which this aspect of our liturgical inheritance has to offer. And then he goes on to kind of say that this is really a microcosm of liturgical reform in general. Our attitude toward approaching the liturgy ought to be one of extreme conservatism, not for the sake of conservatism, but rather because the harm we can do by making the wrong decision affects the continuity of Jewish history and of Jewish religious sentiment itself. There is nothing necessarily sacred about any given liturgical form. What is impressive, however, is the extent to which both conscious and unconscious themes tend to intersect creatively in any liturgical mode. He goes on in this essay to basically say, you know, as a post-Holocaust theologian, we are as violent as any generation that's ever lived. And the experience of sacrifice enabled us to channel that violent impulse toward productive ends. And he doesn't say it quite so explicitly, and I'm happy to send, I have a PDF of the essay. I'm happy to share it if you email me. He basically says that without an outlet for this violent impulse, it will come out in other ways, and B, we've kind of like neutered religion. We've made it too nice, that the religious experience has to take into account all of who we are as human beings, and the sacrifices did that. And so our unwillingness to even recall the sacrifices that were offered is depriving us of bringing religious life, bringing our real experience more into religious life. So that's Rubinstein. I want to, I see Michael and Rivka, Bavakasha, and then I want to do Catherine Madsen, and I want to be sure we have time to get to this Kobe O song. Rivka, please.
Okay.
Oh, or Michael.
Well, I was just going to say, I forgot to take my hand down, so it's just Rivka.
Okay, okay.
My comment
please.
was going back to something Rabbi Belinsky raised about, do the Jews in the pews really know what they're doing? And I think one of the main things is that first step is they know they're doing something for someone else. And so that's a certain change in consciousness that I think is the first step. Maybe they don't have to understand every story and where everything came from, but there are Reform Jews, many I know, and I don't like to label people who say Kaddish for their parents, who do this for a year and who lay tefillin, and the Mishaberik. They know that they are praying to God for someone else, and that's a change in consciousness that I think is important.
Great point. Beautiful point. Thank you for that. Let's look at source number 5. Catherine Madsen. We included a piece of this, an excerpt of this in Mishkan HaNefesh. She is responding to, and I'm sure we've all heard it, the critique of Unatana Tokef. Like, why are we still saying this? This is so, it could appear in some way to be so insensitive to people that have experienced enormous loss. And this idea of God with a book of life, this is, after all, this is a piyut. It's not part of what's really required, quote unquote, in the traditional liturgy. What do we do with this? And again, I think this is a very second naivete approach. This is a critique of the critique. This is moving beyond the critique. This is, you'll see in a moment as we read this, that she says right up front, of course, this is imaginary. Nobody's meant to take this literally. Okay, so let's read it inside. The fantasy of the book of life and God's judgment is memorable, but the extraordinary aspect of the prayer is its emotional impress. Any of us might die of anything, anytime. When? Now or later? With or without warning? Who by stroke and who by cancer? Who by famine and who by plague? Who by collision and who by explosion? We are grass, glass, shadow, atom. Certainly it is imaginary. How else but through imagination do you talk about death in the community where you spend your life, with the people you know, the people you do business with, the people who help you, love you, employ you, exasperate you? Indirection and fable are forms of delicacy. They create an atmosphere in which painful subjects can be raised without speaking of specific deaths that have wounded the people you know. The Unatana Tokef was written in a time when fear and sorrow were closer to the surface of public life than they are now. But in private life, we still know that security is a thin veneer. God suspends the earth over the void, says a piyut in the Yom Kippur Shacharit Amidah. The Unatana Tokef shows us the thread on which it hangs. Any responses to Catherine Madsen or Richard Rubenstein? Yeah, Rini.
She helps me see that it is more about our own mortality, which is certainly a main theme of the day of Yom Kippur, than it is necessarily an explanation for any loss that someone in the congregation has suffered. I have had congregants implore me not to say that prayer because it was so painful for them, and there were years that I didn't say it. But this helps to see that it's about all of us, and it's about us who are alive more than it's about people who have already died.
as we're reading the passage from Rubinstein, maybe think about, I think it's Bruno Bettelheim who wrote about the tendency we have to make fairy tales a little bit softer for our kids these days, and how that may not be such a good idea, that it gives them an opportunity to deal with something. If you take the original versions of the Grimm's fairy tales, or any other of the early versions of the stories that we tend to read at bedtime to our children. And it talks about that idea that maybe they need to be able to have an outlet for discussing these types of issues.
Yeah, I love that connection with his work. And when she writes, when Madsen writes, indirection and fable are forms of delicacy. I think it connects very much with let's say the role of children's stories and legends. Yeah. So Sydney, Adam, and Kenneth.
Thanks. I'm thinking about the concept of sacrifice, and the current moment we're in our country, where we don't have a religious language to talk about George Floyd in a real sense of death and sacrifice and meaning that can come from it, from that process. It feels sort of cheap, to be to try to tie that together, to say, well, there's meaning, there's value that comes out of this loss of life, and yet that's exactly, I think, what the brutality and gore and violence of sacrifice does. Is it takes tragic death and transforms it into a powerful message for life and atonement and moving on and forward. And it's always hard for me to think about the sacrificial rite, because when you have dozens and dozens and hundreds and thousands of sacrifices, this powerful meaning, I think, gets lost in the reality of the experience. But in the metaphorical consideration of the reality of sacrifice, I think there's so much tremendous power and opportunity for human transformation. And so that's what I'm picking up as you're sharing with us. So thank you.
Thank you. I love that. I was thinking, just as you were, this last point, in a way we're at an advantage when we talk about sacrifice, because we're not performing it. It's a recollection, whereas like the prophets were, I'm thinking of like Jeremiah even saying, like, God didn't command you concerning sacrifices. And, it was the critique, that the emphasis that we had lost the forest for the trees. So when we're just dealing with the idea, the concept of sacrifice, we're protected from losing the forest for the trees. Yeah. Please, Adam.
So I'm interested in exploring this from a different angle. I'm coming from the perspective of humanistic Judaism, which is deeply rooted in the adolescent phase of demythologization, but comfortably so, I think, because one of the concerns you haven't really raised is the question of cognitive dissonance, where you're saying things that aren't what you think. And there are ways you can work around it. Think about continuity, as Rubinstein does, or about it as sort of a poetic myth and so on. And that works for some people who tend to fall into the reform and reconstructionist camps. But there are plenty of people who still feel a strong cognitive dissonance with the content of what's being said and repeated. And in some ways, ein tefillah yotzei midei pishuto, that it's tough to get past what it's actually saying. And we're not opposed to using these stories, these legends, as insights into the human condition or as expressions of human longing, but we're willing to flag them as a story, as opposed to leaving it sort of creatively ambiguous, where you can't really tell the difference between first naivete and second naivete because you're not talking about it at all. I think it's in some ways a stronger position to have what I call simultaneous rather than succession. That is, you don't have to get past the critique and like leave it in the rearview mirror and never think about it. it can inform how you understand the story, and you can read the text in multiple ways at the same time. You know, you can have a feminist reading, you can have a critical reading, you can have a literary reading, you can have a psychological reading. They're not exclusive to each other, they can be simultaneous. So I don't see it necessarily as moving from stage 2 to stage 3. It's having a deeper understanding and assimilating all those stages into one.
I really appreciate that. I think this idea of holding lenses simultaneously is very helpful. With the first part of what you were saying, I was thinking a little bit about, you know, just what kind of disposition is required for this notion of second naivete to really, quote unquote, work. And I was thinking about, you know, there's people who love abstract impressionist art. I do. And there's people who look at that, and even when it's titled, are just like, you know, I don't get it. What I see is just a bunch of, you know, splattered paint that was, you know, that I feel like my, you know, 8-year-old could do. And you can take an art history class and still feel that way. So I appreciate that. I appreciate, you know, the distinctions that you're making with the various kinds of religious dispositions, some of which might be more amenable or compatible with this.
One other thought is that sometimes metaphors work for some people and don't work for other people. So someone I know recently posted a poem by Rumi that described human prayer like a dog whining for its master. And the master might not respond, but the dog still feels the need to express the emotional situation. And I thought to myself, I don't find that moving at all. I find that, you know, a problematic dynamic, an abusive dynamic, a literally dehumanizing dynamic. So, you know, the metaphor might, and the person who posted it loved it. They thought it was a wonderful expression of their theology. So, you know, for some people, it'll work to describe the relationship of a God and a human being as master and slave. But for some of us, that metaphor doesn't work anymore and has baggage that just makes it not workable for us. And so it really does come down in some cases to a matter of taste, where for some people, the Aleinu is fine, but Unetana Tokef is a problem. And for other people, it's the opposite. They're going to have different points at which the metaphorical attempt at second naivete is going to fail, because there's something in the rhetoric, there's something in the metaphor that for them strikes them as just too cognitively dissonant to be able to bridge with a sort of as if mentality.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam.
Recently, you know, we had the Yom HaShoah observance, and I've have increasingly found it difficult to use the term Holocaust, and have stuck with Shoah, and because of that, that connection of Holocaust with sacrifices, and the fact that we really should be seeing it more as murder rather than sacrifice, something that was freely offered, and yet that term is better understood, I guess, by people as referring to that period than Shoah, which may be a little bit unfamiliar to some of our folks, and so I'm sort of troubled by that metaphor, and have found it difficulty, you know, to continue using it in our memorial services.
Yeah, thank you for that. Kenneth and Rivka, and then I want to do this Kobe O's song, and I want to kind of try to pull this all together with one Talmudic Agadah that we're familiar with, but I want to give it a different kind of reading.
First of all, I think what Adam was saying sort of resonated with me in many ways, but I think that the problem isn't only that some people can accept a metaphor and other ones can't accept that particular metaphor. I think that for many people, it's within ourselves. There are times when we can accept certain things, and there are times when our skepticism and even opposition come to the fore. When a Tana Tokef is a problematic piyut, it certainly is. On one level, it's a very powerful prayer, which says to us that we're responsible for what we do, and that we'll be held to account for it. And the second part of it, which you referred to before, speaks to us of the fragility of life, that nobody knows what's going to happen to them in the coming year. And next year, some of the people who were sitting around you won't be there anymore. What's problematic about it, Unatana Tokef, is that it leads us to believe that anybody who suffers or anybody who dies does so because they've sinned. And that's a problematic statement. And so I think that for many of us, the ability to recite Unatana Tokef is to sort of compartmentalize it and say to ourselves, well, some of this stuff is very powerful and really speaks to me, but there are other parts of it that I feel are objectionable, and I have to sort of push those down and say, well, maybe some people suffer because of their sins, but not everyone who suffers because of their sins. And that goes for many things. The issue of sacrifice makes me think of martyrdom. And in the Jewish tradition, martyrdom, at least in the Ashkenazic tradition, martyrdom is a very powerful concept. But today we live in a world in which, in the Islamic world, a martyr can be somebody who goes out and kills 50 people and then is killed in the process of doing so. And that's something that's very difficult for us. And finally, it seems to me that there's a difference between being able to have a second, to be able to re-mythologize something to make it meaningful. For example, if we don't believe that the Torah was given to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai and all the mitzvot were commanded directly by God, to struggle with how we can still understand and live by the notion of mitzvah is different than praying for something. The issue of sacrifice in the Siddur, for example, is a problem for me, as for many contemporary Jews. I have no objection to remembering the importance of sacrifice for our ancestors, but I can't bring myself to say words which say, please restore these sacrifices. When I recite Unatana Tokef, I'm not asking God to kill all the wicked people or all those who have sinned or to punish them. But I am doing so when I ask for sacrifices. I also have problems with Avarachamim, which came out of the Crusade period. And I have difficulty making vengeance an important part of my prayer life. And so in my congregation, in the shul where I daven, when they say Av Harachamim, I don't say it.
Right.
I can't
So this is,
right.
I appreciate this exploration of like the pushback of maybe there are things that we can't or we don't want to arrive at a second naivete around. These are really great examples. Rivka, did you have your hand up from before, or did you want to add something here?
This was from here. I just wanted to say that I disagreed with the Mattson, that this is a imaginary prayer. For me, prayer is kind of a cultivation, it's an educational process, and the fixed liturgy becomes an anchor for an aspirational type of cultural, some kind of consciousness. And so for me, this prayer, and I come from, somebody said where they come from, I come from a Jewish mindfulness world. I just came back from a retreat online, The Fragility of Life. And basically this prayer to me is true. This is about the fragility of life, that all things are permanent, that all things are going to come to an end, and life is short and precious. And what do we do with that knowledge? And one of the teachers said, if we understand the nature of impermanence, how could we be anything other than kind? Our heart would be less contentious. And for me, this kind of right heart, right action leads exactly to what is it we can do in the midst of this knowledge? And basically, Jonathan Sachs says, you know, when we say tefillah, tzedakah, shuvah, it's about our relationship with others. How do we act to feel is our relationship to God? Tzedakah is our relationship to others, and shuvah is a relationship to ourselves. So what do we do with this knowledge, and how do we act? And I think this prayer is so real and just talks right to the heart of, look, life is short. How are you going to be in the world? Here's what we're going to do. And your actions matter. And I don't see it as imaginary metaphor, especially in the midst of, we're all here right now, you know, after COVID. there's a gratitude, like, thank God we're here again. But, I think this is a real prayer that addresses the preciousness of life and the fragility, and it says, how are we going to act with this knowledge? And that's what it says to me.
I appreciate that very much. Michael, I'm going to ask you to, I see your hands up, but I'm conscious that we just have 11 minutes left. And
go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I want to share this song with you as another example, I think, of operating within the framework of second naivete. And I want to get to a concluding Talmudic text, and then we'll see where we are. Rini, if you could please stop sharing screen, then I'll share from my end. And here we go. Okay.
Hold on, let me make you the co-host.
Okay. I think it's letting me share anyway.
Oh, it is?
I think so. Hold on. Now I sort of, okay. 1 second. I lost, here we go. Okay. So just to set this up, Kobe Oz, many of you are familiar with him. He's a contemporary artist. He was the lead singer in that group from a decade and a half ago called T-Pex. He now hosts a weekly show on Reshet Bet Radio with different musical artists. About 10 years ago, 15 years ago, he released a CD back in the time when there were CDs called Mizmorei Nevuchim, Songs for the Perplexed. And this song is from that collection. All of the songs were a kind of musical representation of this Hidchadshut Yehudit phenomenon in Israel of reclaiming the Jewish bookshelf, quote unquote secular Jews reclaiming Judaism on their own terms. Kobe Oz was already a hit a pop artist, and his grandfather, Rabbi Nissim Mesika, was a Tunisian immigrant to Israel, and he was a Paitan. And Kobe had been very close to his grandfather. At this stage, Kobe finds in their machsan a shoebox filled with cassette tapes that his now deceased grandfather, the Paitan, had recorded. And Kobe composes a new song that incorporates the recording of his grandfather singing this piyut. It's an extraordinary work. I think that I love this quote unquote text. And I'll just ask you to pay attention to how it's structured, that it opens with Kobe's grandfather singing, and Kobe's grandfather has the last word. And it is kind of a duet, and it isn't. It's actually Kobe, and then it's his grandfather, and then Kobe, his grandfather, Kobe. Only at the very end are they actually singing together. And I want you to contrast the faith. The grandfather's words are, and these didn't make it on your source sheet, but you'll see them appear on the screen. Kobe's grandfather's words are primary naivete, first naivete, right? Ata el, kabetz nidche Yisrael, kabetz nidchenu me'arba kanfot haaretz, ushlach mishichenu malkenu, David ben Peretz. And Kobe's words, by contrast, are filled with skepticism, are filled with a little bit of Israeli cynicism and humor, and yet it's also an expression of faith. And Kobe in this song will give expression to the difficulties of living in this second naivete space. He will say again, I have so much to say thank you for. The presumption here is I can't use my grandfather's words. Those can't be my words. I have to find my own words. But I also want to preserve his words. I want to amplify his words. I want to release his words and his voice on a new CD. but he needs to sing those words. I can't sing those because that isn't my faith, and I have to give expression to my faith. So that's probably enough of a framing. Let me share this. Okay, here we go.
بحضرت عيد وشعته التايل إلواي التايل إلواي التايل قبسنا الحي إسرائيل إلواي قبسنا الحلو لأربع كانت فوتات وسلاح مسيحينو تركينو دافيد بن طارق التايل
יש לי כל כך הרבה דברים לספר לך ואתה הרי הכל יודע יש לי הרבה בקשות לבקש ממך אבל אתה הרי חפץ בטובתי ממילא אני נותן לך חיוך קטן על כל דבר יפה שבו אני מבחין מרשים אוהדים ואני קצת נבוך אני לא יודע איך לקרוא לך אלוהים או אלוקים יש לי המון תודות, תודות, תודות עומדות בתור מול דלתך אבל תודות יוצאות לי קיץ' יש לי מלא בקשות, 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 בקשות לבקש ממך למרות שאצלי בסך הכל בסדר אלוהי אם אתה שומע תפילתי אולי אפשר למסור דש לסבא שלי תגיד לו שהמתינות הספרדית שבה הוא דגל התחלפה בקנאות, קיצוניות אבל למרות הכל הסובלנות רוכשת מתחת לפני השטח תראה לאט לאט אנשים יוצאים מהמתח ורוצים בסך הכל להיות ביחד בבית הכנסת הגדול הזה שנקרא ארץ ישראל פה כולם מוזמנים להביט אל השמיים להתפלל לגשמים לפחד מטילים יש לי המון תודות, תודות, תודות עומדות בתור מול דלתך אבל תודות יוצאות לי קיץ' יש לי מלא בקשות, 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 בקשות לבקש ממך למרות שאצלי בסך הכל בסדר יש לי המון תודות, תודות, תודות עומדות בתור מול דלתך אבל תודות יוצאות לי קיץ' יש לי מלא בקשות, 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 בקשות לבקש ממך למרות שאצלי בסך הכל בסדר
חבד מלחנו מארבע כנף מוסר וסלח מסייחנו תרגינו דוד ונפר التايل
Now, there's so much to say about this. We could do a whole hour just on that text. You know, also the Eastern musical mode and the Western musical mode and the young and the old and the faithful and the skeptical. But I'm bringing it here because this is an example, I think, of a second naivete. How do I reclaim a text of the past and understand it in a new way. Well, one way of understanding it in a new way is to go back to recur, right? It's about interpretation. By interpreting, we can hear again. So look what he enabled us to do. Look what he enabled thousands of listeners to do. By interpreting, he enabled us to hear the words of his grandfather again. And he doesn't have to go back to that primary naivete. He can't sing those words. A lot of other musical artists in Israel over the last 10 years have recorded new musical settings to medieval piyutim. He could have just written a new melody, or he could have sang his grandfather's melody, but he had to write his own melody as a commentary to his grandfather's. The final text I want to bring, and Rini, if you don't mind just sharing that last text on the source sheet, is this text is familiar, I'm sure, to all of us, of God holding Mount Sinai over Bnei Israel and saying, if you accept the Torah, good, and if not, this will be your grave. And of course, this is from Shabbat 88a. And of course, this is, the problem that the rabbis are playing with is that a contract made under coercion is an invalid contract. So how could it be that God threatened them with death? How can that be a real acceptance of the Torah? And I want to tie in the response by way of conclusion into what we were talking about. The response is to bring this totally out of context phrase from Megillat Esther, which is about the acceptance of the establishment of Purim and sending mishlochei manot and matanot le'evyonim, and saying in the book of Esther, the Jews of that age accepted upon this, kimu v'kiblu. They accepted and they fulfilled these rules about this new holiday of Purim. And here the Agadah in Masechet Shabbat is saying, no, something much more profound was happening. When the Megillah tells us, kimu v'kiblu, that in the time of Mordechai and Esther, the Jews reaffirmed what had been coerced from them at Mount Sinai, I think there's something very profound being said here, because the generation of Mordechai and Esther is the age in which God is hidden and clear miracles are absent. The miracles that are happening are subtle and behind the scenes. And yet the Agadah here is saying that's precisely the moment in which Torah is fulfilled. Kimu v'kiblu, kimu masha kiblu kvar. They fulfilled or reaffirmed that which they had already accepted. What I want to suggest is that their reading, the generation of Mordechai and Esther, was a kind of second naivete, that the Torah could be fulfilled, kimu v'kiblu, it could be fulfilled in very different times and circumstances, a time when acceptance of Torah is far more challenging. And I think that time, or the contrast between the Sinai generation and the Mordechai and Esther generation, is very descriptive of the time in which we're living in. That the power of coercive acceptance is long gone. That rabbis no longer have the kind of authority that they had through much of Jewish history. That we understand sacred texts in different ways. That our relationship with God has shifted away from a kind of pure autonomy that's represented from the mountain being held over our heads. And we're like the generation of Mordechai and Esther. And we need a new way that enables us to re-embrace Torah and mitzvot. And most of us no longer feel the mountain suspended over our heads, but like the generation of Mordechai and Esther, we're longing for a lasting connection to the generation that stood at Sinai. And maybe second naivete is one lens, one way of experiencing that connection and that way of embracing and accepting and fulfilling when the mountain is no longer suspended over our heads. I want to thank you. I don't know, Rini, can we run over for a few minutes for some comments? And
Yasher Koach.
okay, Baruch Tia.
Yes, we certainly can. We certainly can.
So please, Michael, Kenneth.
Well, I guess I just wanted to first of all, thank you. This was terrific. And I guess if the Unasana Tokev text, and it may have been where that piece originally appeared. I think if I remember, there was a Reformed CCAR journal that focused on some of it. It was some journal that had a whole series of articles, which were excellent. Is that the question is, why do we isolate the one paragraph from the totality of Unasana Tokev? It's as if you look at the totality of Unasana Tokev, in many ways it deconstructs itself at times. And so I just want to throw that out there, but
Michael,
I understand.
I think
okay, anyway.
You might be referring to an article that our colleague and teacher Maggie Wenig wrote.
Oh, that's it, right, that's
in
it,
which
right.
she emphasized the last line. The last line is, and it was missing from Gates of Repentance, but it's in Mishkan HaNefesh, is, you call us by your name, which she translates as, your name is linked with ours. And she sees that as like the denouement of this prayer. Yeah, it's a beautiful article. There's a version of it in the volume of Mishkan HaNefesh for Rosh Hashanah. Sorry, Michael, I just wanted to insert that it was Maggie Wenig.
Yeah, no, that's just the point I wanted to make. I think it's, I think we can almost first and second naivete the prayer itself. And I think it does that to itself, but yeah, okay.
Thank you so much. Kenneth.
Yeah, just a couple of brief points. The Kiblu V'Kimu, many years ago, I heard Eliezer Berkovitz give a talk, and that is sort of being the key to the continuation of Jewish life post-Holocaust times. And I think it underlies Yitz Greenberg's essay on the third stage of Jewish, I can't remember what he called it, the post-Holocaust Jewish life, that we need a new covenant with God today. Just a request, perhaps through Rini, you could send us the names of, I'm familiar with the notion of second Naivete, but something by Ricoeur and something by Simone that's available in English that sort of shows how they developed these ideas, if we want to read further. And just about Ricoeur, I looked up from Professor Wikipedia while you were talking about him, and he wasn't a Catholic, he came from a Huguenot family. And that might explain some of where he's coming from.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm happy to send along some of those references, and I'm just putting in the chat just the YouTube link for the Kobe O song. Great. Thank you all so much. Yeah, Rini, please.
I am clapping for you, but I don't know how to raise my hand, so I did the clapping thing. While you were talking, I was thinking a lot about Sukkot. I'm just curious how you personally feel on Sukkot when I go to shul and I have my lulav and my etrog and I'm standing in a congregation of people like walking around and doing that. That is the one time of year more than any other that kind of brings out this judgmental side of me that I dislike. And I think part of what you're saying today also is like, we don't always know what other people are thinking. We don't know what other people are thinking when they're davening. And we shouldn't even try to. We should focus on what we're thinking about when we're davening. And for me, be grateful that there are people around us supporting us in what we're doing. But I'm just curious how this second naivete specifically speaks to you on Sukkot. That is the one holiday that I really probably struggle with the most in terms of the physicality of the ritual and what we're doing, because I do know the history of it, and it just feels uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think it's such a great example and an illustration of what we're talking about. I, Davka, love how primitive it feels. I guess like using this lens, and understanding the physicality and understanding the gendered nature of the lulav and the etrog, and seeing this as kind of like the Jewish fertility rain dance. It makes me like it even more, and because we're able to have all these other perspectives. We're able to understand it in a new way. We're able to kind of hold the primary naivete. The demythologization is so, it's so easy. I mean, that's kind of your point. Like with this, it's so clear that there's, how to demythologize it. And yet I love coming out on the other side and what it means to be with this contemporary community, singing Hallel with it and doing Hoshanot with it. And I get, appreciating what Adam was sharing. Like, I get how not everybody's going to be able to think about it in that second naivete kind of way, and how understandable it is to not be able to move beyond the critique. So I think it's a great illustration. I want to give Mark, you haven't said anything yet, and then I have to hop off, but I'll give you Mark the final comment or question. Or
it's just not a question, it's just a comment. Just a sense that we have to hold a tension in some ways. I mean, throughout this, I'm thinking about it's not either or, it's a tension that we have to hold. And it's uncomfortable, but it's a tension. Like we have to hold so many things in in our lives that are in tension with one another. That was my only comment. And it's uncomfortable sometimes, but necessary, I think.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Thank you for that articulation. I wish I could stay on longer. I'm really grateful. I'm grateful to your colleague, Rabbi Rini Dickman, for inviting me, and I'm grateful to all of you to have this opportunity to havruta these texts and these ideas. I'll just put a little plug in because Rini told me I could. This is our recruitment season for our year-long programs at Pardes. And we were able to successfully have an in-person, mostly in-person program this year in Jerusalem, abiding by all of the health and safety rules. We plan on having a very set of robust programs next year, a program for Jewish educators and Jewish experiential educators, and our signature program, just the one-year program. All of them are for college graduates and up, all ages. And we found that a lot of people, particularly because of COVID, are open to taking a year off, using a year to recalibrate, or so please send your congregants and your friends our way. We're open for business. And we look forward to welcoming them to our Beit Midrash. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you so much. Yasher Koach. May you go from strength to strength. And we hope to see you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leon.
Be well.
Been really
Bye,
good.
Leon.
Really good.
I see that a couple other people had things to say. Michael and Kenneth, do you want to
Oh,
make
not
your
me,
comments?
not me.
Oh, okay. I also just want to tell everyone, and you'll get more emails about it, that we have 2 speakers coming end of May, Dr. Erica Brown, and then the first week of June. They're consecutive weeks that Rabbi Naomi Levy is gonna speak to us. They're both on Zoom, but we had decided to do our high holiday prep sessions early this year because the holidays are so early. So please look for emails about that. And it's great to see you all. I hope you're in good health. Anyone else want to make any announcements? Nope. Okay.
It's
Have a
nice to
great
see
day.
folks.
Yes, it
Always.
is. And oh, another thing we talked about is getting together in person in August to share either Kavanot or sermon ideas, kind of workshop together before High Holy Days. So you'll receive information about that too, but it would be wonderful to see everyone together. That will probably be outside, but we'll figure it out. So thank you. Okay. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Take care.